I think another important date right underneath it, when Israel split into two kingdoms. You know that story? It just reminds you of what Israel kind of looks like. And this is the south here, and this is the north. But once upon a time, they didn't have any line in between. But they had a civil war, maybe not as bloody as our civil war, but they certainly split. Tell me the story of the split. Do you remember? Why did they split? Let me give you a hint. It was probably the #1 issue in our last election for a lot of people. Don't say Obama. But what was the big issue for people?
The economy.
Yeah, and related to that, taxes, right? The Tea Party movement and taxes. Remember Solomon? Solomon builds the temple. Solomon has a lot of building programs. What does it take to build things? Money. And sometimes forced labor. There was probably some forced labor under Solomon as well. And so you get that going on, and then suddenly there's a new inauguration, there's a new president coming to power, king in this case, and that's going to be Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And what do you suppose people are going to ask Rehoboam? What are they going to want on his campaign platform? Lower taxes, please lower taxes, right? And does he?
He did the opposite.
He did the opposite. He said, boy, you thought my dad was bad? Just wait. Just wait to see how bad this is going to get. I'm going to raise your taxes even more. And so he did, and the north and the south split. And, you know, this is where the Bible can be so confusing, but the north became Israel, also Samaria, also Ephraim, also other things, but principally Israel, and the south became what? Judah, which in the New Testament is known as Judea, right? But yeah, if the Bible would just stick to one name sometimes, it'd be easier for us. But Israel, Samaria, and Ephraim, it gets called all those things. So they had a split, and they never really did get back together again. So, key dates in the Bible. You see somewhere around 721, 722 it says to 720, there was the fall of the northern kingdom. Who conquered them? By the way, there were 10 tribes here. 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. Who conquered the north? Do you know? Assyria. Assyria came and conquered the north. And a lot of those tribes just got scattered. And there were certainly some people left behind, and the Assyrians, doing what conquerors often do, said, well, we've got some people in jail and other folks that we don't really like. We're tired of paying taxes on them and providing for them, so let's move them here, and they can intermarry with the folks that are left behind, right? So that's kind of what happened here, and these people then became known ultimately as the Samaritans, right? Is this making sense? Am I going too fast? These people became known as the Samaritans, half-breeds, if you want to use that kind of term, and they were always kind of at odds with the more racially separate Judeans in the south. So they fell around 721 BC, and they really never came back. They were just scattered to the wind and never really came back home again. Another important date was the fall of Jerusalem in the south, the kingdom of Judah. Who did they fall to? I bet you know this. Who conquered Judah in the south? Do you remember? Babylon. You know this story. Remember the king? What was his name? King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar conquered them. King Nebuchadnezzar. And so Babylon conquered them about 587. Like the Exodus, that is probably the pivotal date in the Old Testament. Because why? Suddenly, you don't have a nation anymore. You know, 1776 is our formative kind of date. and then suddenly you took our nation away, we're going to remember that date, that event, those events around that forever. Israel goes off to Babylon. Really, a good chunk of the nation goes off to Babylon. We'll look at a map in a second. But it's when they're in Babylon that they start to really form and cement their identity of who they're going to be going forward. They're going to write down almost all the stories they haven't written down before. It's very important that you remember and that you tell those stories and that you write them down if at all possible. And there was the ability to write them down in Babylon. Some of your traditions are going to become even more important than they are in the old country. I mean, think about us and think about the craziness that Norwegians can have towards lutefisk and lefse, right? We're crazier about that stuff than people in Norway are, aren't we? I don't like lutefisk all that well, but some of you people do, and you go to Norway, and those people don't really have much time for lutefisk, do they? So you leave your old country, and some of those traditions become very important. For Israel, during the Exodus, you know what became very important, or during the exile, you know what became very important? The Sabbath and circumcision. Those two things became critically important, marks of their identity. And you can understand why, can't you? So those are very important dates. Right underneath that, the date they returned from exile, 538 BC. There was a King Cyrus of Persia that conquered Babylon. King Cyrus. They thought so highly of him that they referred to him at times as the Lord's anointed, which is another way of talking about the Lord's Messiah, the Lord's King. And King Cyrus said, you can all go home. And by the way, I'm going to give you money to help rebuild your temple. So very important date in the Bible. If you turn to the next page and the New Testament timeline, of course, the birth of Jesus is one of those important dates. Why was it between 6 BC and 4 BC? Do you know? Anybody remember?
Because they didn't have a Julian calendar?
They didn't have the right calendar, the Julian calendar. The dates, basically, that we go by today have all been determined by looking back. Much later, looking back, and they weren't necessarily trying to fix the date of Jesus' birth at 0 when they did that. But they looked backwards. The Julian calendar is exactly right. And when that time came, basically, we know from the birth and death of Herod the Great that Jesus was born during that time. I mean, that's the story in Matthew, right? So Jesus was born sometime BC, according to present-day calendars. An important date, of course, Jesus crucified sometime around AD 30. He was probably around 33 years old. Hard to say exactly, but something like that. And we get that date from reading the Gospels, but we get it more so from the tradition. When a Jewish rabbi started his public ministry, he was generally 30 years old. So that's where we determine that date from as much as anything. And then finally, Paul taken prisoner in Jerusalem and moved to Caesarea and finally to Rome, somewhere around 58 to 60 AD, and he probably ended up dying in Rome at the hands of Nero, perhaps around 62, 63 AD, somewhere in there. Any questions about that? This is all review, just to kind of give you a sense of what we covered in 101. And hopefully make our walk through the Bible a little easier. Our next section you will principally read at home, but I'm going to cover just a few things from that, okay? And it has to do with the geography of the Bible, kind of the layout, the landscape. Let me ask a question as we get into some of this. Would it be helpful sometime, you can say no, but if I brought some slides to show you of the Holy Land, would that be helpful? So you can see some things? Yeah. And if you want to fall asleep during those, that's fine too. But I'll bring some slides. I could have brought them today, but they're in Minneapolis, and it's a long trip there and back. But but I'll get them and I'll bring them down and we'll have slideshows sometime.
It would be helpful to see a then and now map to be made more recent.
We can do some of that. Yeah, we will certainly, anytime we look at a map, we'll try to talk about some of the modern historical parallels to things. Yeah. Well, we'll look at some visual slides along the way as well. Turn to map number 1 under geography. In the Old Testament, there are three principal areas of land. Tell me what they are. What are the 3 principal areas that get talked about in the Old Testament?
Syria.
One is Egypt, the Holy Land, also known at that time as a variety of things, but Canaan at first, right? Canaan, and then Israel, and Mesopotamia. Very good. Mesopotamia. Those are the 3 big areas in the Old Testament. So you can find all of those on the map. Notice how big, we only see a corner of Egypt, but Egypt's huge. Canaan, little tiny sliver of land. Mesopotamia, huge. What's in Mesopotamia today, by the way? Iraq and Iran. Iran is over to the right side of that. You see the Persian Gulf, that body of water there. Kuwait would be at the top of the Persian Gulf, right? So you can find all those places. In the middle of that big thing, in the middle is Saudi Arabia, right? Great big deserts in Saudi Arabia. I think it's interesting to note how small Israel is. Israel's basically Rhode Island. It's just a tiny sliver of land, but notice how strategic it is. I mean, you don't go around Israel because there's desert and mountains. You go through it. And sometimes, if it's in your way, you just take it. You conquer it. You can see why people like Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrians got carried away and just took it, because it was so strategically important to that region. You can see why the Greeks eventually took it, and the Romans eventually took it and occupied it. And so a lot of the story in the Bible relates to that occupation and who owns the land at this particular time. Okay? Is that clear enough? Let's go on to the second map. And again, I encourage you to read some of the text in here. I think it'll fill this out. I think it's interesting to note that just like Great Britain once upon a time was full of trees, then the Vikings came and chopped them all down to a large extent, at least a lot of them down. The same was true in Palestine. If you go there, anybody been to Palestine today or Israel? Yeah, there's not a lot of trees, is there? But once upon a time, the central section of the country was completely forested. Trees and trees and more trees. There were certainly some fertile valleys, Jezreel Valley and other valleys, the Jordan River Valley, but once upon a time heavily forested. But you begin to see what this place looked like when the tribes came through and the conquest happened. Now there's some debate over whether the conquest was gradual or the conquest was rapid. I think you could probably read Joshua and get both stories from that. But nevertheless, Israel came in under Joshua, and you see the 12 tribes that are listed. We won't name them all, but Simeon, Dan, Judah, Ephraim, Benjamin, Reuben, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, and others. That's the land among the 12 tribes. They were a loose tribal confederacy at that time. You know, a little bit like, what did we have in America at the beginning? Do you remember? We had colonies. The 13 colonies, didn't we? Well, they had 12 tribes. Not all that different. Loosely organized, but getting more organized. And they had a loose tribal confederacy for a number of years under Joshua, and then under the other leaders that followed him. What were those leaders called?
Judges.
Judges. Very good, judges. You know some of them. Gideon, Deborah, and others. So, a loose tribal confederacy.